Good morning, church. Picture this. What does it mean and what does it look like to love people? Grab that image in your mind. If somebody walked up to you and said, "Hey, what does it look like? Tangibly, tell me. Explain to me. What does it look like to love people?" Put that image in your mind. In our series today and over the last couple of weeks, we've been asking the question of what it means to steward our relationship with God. What does it mean to take care of, to invest in, to pour into this relationship that we have with the Lord? In week one, we discovered that in order to do this, in order to steward our relationship with Him, we need to first and foremost love Him. We need to fall head over heels, deeply, madly in love with Him, be in awe of who He is, and then out of that love, we then follow Him. In week two, we saw that following Him requires us to invest in His kingdom with our talents, with our time, with our treasure, and with our testimony. That's why this upcoming week's Gospel 101 course kickoff is so important. Because most statistics prove and kind of show that about 95% of Christians will never share their faith with another person. And I believe that number is so large, not necessarily because of any other reason than this. I think sometimes we get in a place to go, how do I do this? What does it look like to share the gospel? We get bogged down and the enemy instills fear in our hearts that we're going to somehow mess it up. And over the coming weeks, we're going to talk about how you can't mess up your story. And if your story is rooted in His story, it's an argument that can't be argued with. You know what I mean? So just share your story, but we'll talk about that. So we invest into His kingdom. That is how we pour back into our relationship. But today, we're going to learn about loving our neighbor as ourself, otherwise known as loving people. But I want to start our time off by sharing a few quotes from some visitors that have come to our church. So let me kind of unpack what I mean by this. So every single week we have a service, right? And at the end of the service, at some point in the service, we invite first-time guests to go out to our connection desk and go meet some folks at our lobby and get some coffee mugs or whatever gift we're given today, and they give us some information, and then they get put into kind of this system where we either send them a card or a phone call or a text message, and we follow up with them. And one of those emails or text messages that we give is a quick survey. And we just ask, hey, would you give us some information about what you thought about in this service? And we send this survey to help us measure really how well we love people. And a lot of the questions are geared towards analyzing our services, like, hey, what did you experience in kids or our treehouse, or what in the service? How was the worship, the teaching? But our internal question isn't really, hey, how well did we provide a service? This isn't the Ritz-Carlton. This isn't Disney. So as much as we do care about good, quote-unquote, customer service, honestly, the question that we are asking as leadership is going, how well did we love people? How well did we greet them? How well did they feel like this was a place that loved them? And so I'd like to read just a few comments from people that have sent us some replies to that survey. The first one is this: there hasn't been a single service we have attended where multiple people didn't come up to shake our hand and say they are glad we are here. The next one: over several services, I was greeted very kindly by several different people who invited me to return and told me about other activities of the church. Next, everyone came to speak with us, not just the staff, but many of the congregation. And lastly, we came to an event and everyone was super welcoming. Then we came to the church that following Sunday and people remembered us from the event, which we were impressed with. Multiple people reached out to us to personally multiple people reached out to us to personally and introduced us to others in the church as well. Everyone was very warm and inviting. Also, the first Sunday we attended, we brought our son, and all of the people helping family check-ins were sweet and made me feel extremely comfortable leaving my son, which I greatly appreciate. Amen. right? I mean, we can get a clap. You ain't got to act like you're dead, right? There's not another shoe that's going to fall here. I didn't read those to set you up and tear you down. I read those because I wanted to share with you that right there is what I hear most often about our church. This little humble congregation loves people as they walk in. And I want to say thank you. I just, from the bottom of my heart, when I get these surveys and they come back to us and we see some of these stories, and these are not just handpicked out of the bad ones. The majority of the people who fill out a survey and get us back always have something nice to say, at least about y'all, right? I want to share that the average church's visitor retention rate, meaning somebody who comes into their church, fills out a card, and then either stays or goes, the retention rate for the average church is somewhere between 6 and 15%. In 2023, our retention rate was 46%. Yeah. In 2024, we're a little lower, but we're still 34% of the people who filled out a connection card got a seat at the table. And amen. And a lot of that happens because you love people. And I wanted to share these things with you for two reasons. First, what we celebrate gets repeated. And so I want you to know, I want you to continue to greet people. I want you to continue to open the doors and your arms to people in this place, no matter where they come from in life, no matter what they look like, no matter their story. We are people that embrace people. That is who we are. We are found people. And when you are found, you find people. Found people, find people. Thank you for being such a loving church. The second reason I want to share this with you is because I believe that when we continue to greet people and push people to open their arms and their life to each other, I believe that high fives, handshakes, and greetings matter. But I also know that seeing someone isn't the same as knowing someone. So as much as I want to celebrate how well we greet people, I want to push you to be people to know others, okay? Like, we're not just a church that I believe wants to just say, hey, man, thank you so much for coming, and that's the end of the conversation, right? That needs to be the beginning of the conversation. Because in a room like this, we could have people week in and week out who come in, and man, they get really greeted. But over 4, 5, 6, 7 weeks, are they known? And it's one thing to be greeted. It's completely different to be known. And that's a little bit of what we're diving into in this passage in Mark chapter 12, is more than just, hey, we love you, we see you. But it's diving in and saying, I want to know you. I want to walk with you in your life. Mark chapter 12, Jesus has several encounters with rich, powerful religious leaders. And on most of these occasions, Jesus told these leaders that they were wrong, or their hearts were in the wrong place. But in our passage today, he tells them that that they are close to the kingdom, but they need to be doing these certain things. And at the end of that passage, as JG read for us earlier, we've hit the last two. If you haven't been in the last couple weeks, you can go back and read them. We've been in this passage camping out in Mark chapter 12. So I'm just going to read verse 31, if you'll read with me. We've already read, the guy's trying to test Jesus. He comes back. He says, the most important commandment is to love your Lord your God with all your heart, soul, strength, and mind. And then he says, the second is this: you shall love your neighbor as yourself. There is no other commandment greater than these. Last week we spoke about loving God. And in this passage, he's quoting Deuteronomy 6, Exodus 20, and he's summarizing all of this from those Old Testament passages, and he looks at those 10 commandments, say the first 4, how we love God, the second 6 are how we love people. And then he looks at them and he says, here is how you do it. Here's how you live out the law. This is what he's looking at this religious leader, and he's saying, all right, you got to love the Lord your God with all your heart, soul, mind, and strength. But you need to love your neighbor as yourself. And if we're not careful, what we can do is we can look at these as 1 and 2. But if you go back to his language and you go back to the original text, really what he's saying is that 1 and 2 are equals. They are just as important. We need to know that this is not the second commandment or a secondary commandment. It is just as essential as the first command to love God. He says, love God and love people. There are no other greater commandments than these. In some ways, you could translate it like this. When he says the first one to love God, and then he goes to the second one, he says, you could translate it like this. The second is like it. So just as important as loving God is loving people. And I think we understand to a degree what he means. Because we understand this. When he says love your neighbor as yourself, most of us love ourselves decently. Now, we're not perfect in that. We have some negative speech sometimes to ourselves. Sometimes the enemy puts some lies in our life that we hold on to and we take them as truths. But I think for the majority of us, we do speak well of ourselves. We're at least thinking about our best at times, right? You know, even if you have some bad self-image issues or whatever in your life, you're still worried about your health, right? You're still worried about how you appear for the most part. Right? You think about yourself highly. But what does it mean to love your neighbor as yourself? Let's answer the first question of what does it mean to be a neighbor? Let's not overthink this, okay? It's really anyone and everyone. It's the people who we come in contact with. It's the waiter at lunch, the mailman, the teacher at your child's school, friends, family members. People who have different political ideologies than we do. I want to point you to a story in Luke chapter 10 that you've probably heard or read over the years. I want to read it, and we're going to answer the question of what's a neighbor by Jesus' own words in a different teaching. Luke chapter 10, verse 25. And behold, a lawyer stood up to put him to the test, saying, Teacher, what shall I do to inherit eternal life? He says back to the teacher, he says back to the lawyer, what is written in the law? How do you read it? And he answered, you shall love the Lord your God with all your heart, with all your soul, with all your strength, and with all your mind, and your neighbor as yourself. Jesus says to him, you have answered correctly. Do this, and you will live. The lawyer wants to go a step further. He says, but he, desiring to justify himself, says to Jesus, who is my neighbor? Jesus replies with a story. A man was going down from Jerusalem to Jericho, and he fell among robbers, who stripped him and beat him and departed, leaving him half dead. Now by chance, a priest was going down that road, and when he saw him, he passed by on the other side. So likewise, a Levite, when he came to the place and saw him, pass by on the other side. But a Samaritan, someone who would have no reason to meet with a Jew, someone who was hated by the Jews. They couldn't have been less in common. They were almost enemies in the average everyday life. But a Samaritan, as he journeyed, came to where he was, and when he saw him, he had compassion. He went to him and bound up his wounds, pouring on oil and wine. Then he set him on his own animal and brought him to an inn and took care of him. And the next day he took out 2 denarii and gave them to the innkeeper, saying, take care of him, and whatever more you spend, I will repay you when I come back. Which of these 3 do you think proved to be a neighbor to the man who fell among the robbers? And he said, the one who showed him mercy. And Jesus said to him, you go and do likewise. We broke this text down in our Luke series a couple of months ago, and if what you'll remember is this picture of this Samaritan is ultimately a picture of Jesus. It's ultimately this idea that Jesus goes above and beyond in seemingly reckless ways, according to our world standards, to love people. And what Jesus is pointing back to in this moment, and he's pointing to you and to me, is that we are to live lives like Jesus. If we have been called to love him and love others, what we've been called to be, and we've been commissioned and equipped to be, is a family of servant missionaries. Loving people begins by loving God. And from that place, we then operate with the heart that he has given us. Not from a place of flesh, not from a place of what's best for me. We operate from a place of what's best for the kingdom. So when he says love your neighbor as yourself, he is ultimately saying back to you, how well did Jesus love you this far? He went the greatest lengths. He died for you while you spit in his face, while you denied him, while you sinned against him, while your sins hung him on that cross. He willfully said, I go the distance for you. And then he calls you and I to love others in that fashion. Not so easy, is it? It's really easy to hear. It's really easy to theologically break it down and go, oh yeah, love our neighbor as ourselves. I mean, I just got to help the poor, maybe give a little bit at the church, and we'll be good. When I see somebody in need, maybe pull over. But if it looks too sus, maybe don't pull over because I got to worry about my own health, right? And then Jesus gives this story, and he says, I went the greatest lengths. So when you're supposed to love your neighbor as yourself, you will do as I do unto others. And you go, well, what didn't Jesus do? That dude stopped for everybody. That dude paid the ultimate price. But there's like logic, man. I can't put myself in those situations, right? Because that wouldn't be wise. That wouldn't be good stewardship. I got to steward my relationship with God. How can I steward my relationship with God if I'm dead because I helped someone on the side of the road and they killed me, right? You self-talk like this, right? Am I alone? Am I the only sinner in the room? We do this. But yet we go back to the text, and he says, love everyone in the world, the enemy of you, the Samaritan and the Jew, the people who don't get along together, maybe the Democrat, the Republican, right? Maybe in different socioeconomic statuses, maybe different racial places, ethnicities, all these, maybe people from one side of the track to the other side of the track, whatever it may be, you need to love them like I love you, and I gave it all, is what he says to us. And sometimes when I hear that, I'm going to be honest, he goes, man, I don't know if I'm ready to do that, because it's messy. That's hard, man. How can I do this? And what Jesus is looking at us and saying is, you do it by love me, and I'll change you, and I'll mold you. Don't expect to go this 180 difference overnight, but expect to willfully and every day humbly deny yourself so that he can live, because your flesh is getting in the way, but his spirit is greater. Jesus is calling us to have a radical faith that fuels us to treat others well, even when they don't do the same to us. Matthew 7:12, so whatever you wish that others would do to you, do also to them, for this is the law and the prophets. Romans 13:8, owe no one anything except to love each other, for the one who loves another has fulfilled the law. For the commandments, you shall not commit adultery, murder, steal, covet, and any other commandment are summed up in these words. You shall love your neighbor as yourself. Love does no wrong to a neighbor. Therefore, love is fulfilling the law. And this is not the kind of thing that we can fake. Loving someone like this, loving people like this can only come from one place. You can't pull this whole fake it till you make it deal. I'm just going to kind of get into the routine and hopefully it changes. No, you get into the routine of humbly submitting and denying yourself so that he can be shown through your actions. Because we only know love by him. 1 John 4:19, we love because he first loved us. If anyone says, I love God and hates his brother, he is a liar. For he who does not love his brother whom he has seen cannot love God whom he has not seen. And this commandment we have from him: whoever loves God must also love his brother. Love comes from God. So there are three things that we need to do to love people. There are three things that I want to give you to help you walk and steward this relationship with God so that you can live out the commandment that he's given you to love people. The first thing we need to do is we need to recognize the love of God. We preached about this, so I won't spend a lot of time, but Romans 5:8, but God shows his love for us in that while we were still sinners, Christ died for us. That reality has to become a living, breathing mechanism in our life to remind us of the love of God. Romans 10:12-13, for there is no distinction between Jew and Greek, for the same Lord is Lord of all, bestowing his riches on all who call on him. For everyone who calls on the name of the Lord will be saved. Every single person needs to hear the glorious news of the love of God. Like everyone, like the person you can't stand at your job needs to hear about God. And they need to hear about it from your words and your actions. You know what I mean? Like if they hear about it from your words and your actions don't line up, think about that message. Man, I love Coke, but I walk in with a Pepsi every Sunday. Right? Do I love Coke? Maybe I love Pepsi. You shouldn't love Pepsi, but they should start giving me like a little kickback money. Anyway, we need to proclaim with our words and with our deeds the love of God. We need to fall in love with him on a daily basis. And that begins in a lot of ways for us by spiritual disciplines. You will not love people well if you are not stewarding your relationship with God well and bowing the knee in the morning and in the midday and in the evening by looking at him and saying, God, I am in awe and in reverence of who you are. Thank you for loving me when I don't love you. So often, I deny you with my lips and with my actions. Thank you for your forgiveness. We can then pass that forgiveness to others. First thing we need to do is recognize the love of God. The second thing we need to do is we need to realize that we need each other. We need each other. In the New Testament, there are over 50 commandments on how we love each other. These are most known as the one another's. And I'm not really going to show them to you this morning because there's like so many. There's 50. But I will send them out in an email this week. But I want to remind you of their dual purpose. These one another's, here's how we should treat each other. Love one another like this. Greet one another like that. Help each other like this. First, they are essential because God cares for us. And when we become followers of Jesus, the Spirit calls us to care for each other. In some ways, this is called shepherding. This is called caring for people. MC leaders and co-leaders, this is your directive: to care for people, to shepherd people. The elders of the church are called to shepherd. We are all called to care for and shepherd other believers in at least 50 different ways. And if you're looking for encouragement and more profound teaching on how do we do this, how do we care for each other, how do we care for other people, next Saturday, I think I have a slide for this. Maybe. New City is putting on, maybe I didn't put it in there. Did I not put it in there? Okay, sorry. Next Saturday, New City is hosting a shepherding course led by a guy named Abe Weisenberg. And I'd love for you to join me. It's going to be a great Saturday. If you're looking for more information on that, it's all about how we can shepherd people well and how we can care for their souls. I'll be sending an email link to sign up for that this week. But the first thing we need to do is recognize that these are given to us to help us care for others. The second, these one another's are given to us because the most important way that we will show the world the gospel is how we care for one another. Think about the most important way that you will share the gospel is how you care for one another. John 13:35, by this all people will know that you are my disciples if you have love for one another. Are we a church that exudes, that just shows people the love of God? Or is there backbiting? Is there dissension? Is there gossip? And maybe it's not even like as a collective church. When you go out into the world as a Christ follower, what do your actions point to? Are you someone that people come around and go, man, I could hang out with that guy or that girl? Or are you someone who's, man, they're always negative. They always got this, that, and the other to say. They're always throwing somebody under the bus. They're not very generous. They're not very forgiving. They're not very loving. And listen, if you find yourself in that place, you are not alone, and there is grace at the foot of the cross. Submit and humbly come to Him and ask Him to change you and work. I have been called negative a lot in my life. I still get called negative a lot in my life. Okay? Y'all are all wrong. No, I'm just kidding. I'm a pragmatist, so I do look at both sides. So one of the things I try to remind myself every single day is, what's the best way to share Jesus? And it isn't by going up to someone and telling them the negative thing. Maybe it's just not saying anything. Maybe it's pointing to them, hey, this could work. What about this? Have you thought about that? There's all sorts of things that we can do, and if you don't know how to break the habit that you're in, find others. Go back to this idea that we need each other. This can help you. We need each other. These 50 ways I'll email you, but they basically look like this. To love one another. To honor one another, greet one another, to welcome one another, show hospitality to one another, have fellowship with one another, agree with one another, live in harmony with one another, be at peace with one another, be kind to one another, forgive one another, bear with one another, bear one another's burdens, comfort one another, care for one another, confess sins to one another. That doesn't sound right. We don't want to do that, right? Pray for one another, encourage one another, build one another up, exhort one another, instruct one another. Teach and admonish one another, sing with one another, stir up one another to love and good works, do good to one another, serve one another, wash one another's feet, wait for one another, be humble toward one another, submit to one another, speak the truth to one another, do not speak against one another, do not judge one another, do not provoke one another, do not envy one another. Over 50 verses point us to how to love each other. We need each other to do this. Hebrews chapter 10, verse 24. Let us consider how to stir up one another to love and good works. Not neglecting to meet together, as is the habit of some, but encouraging one another, and all the more as you see the day drawing near. We need each other if we're going to love people, if we're going to love the lost, if we're going to love the found, we need each other. Like, I need you, and you need me. This is how we begin to love people in the way that He's called us to. We recognize His love. We walk in it. We function in it. Then we spur each other on. We encourage each other. We call each other out at times. And we say, hey, we're not just the church who gathers. We're the church who does life with each other. We are a family. And then the third one, love does. I got a quote from a guy named Bob Goff. He says, I don't think anyone aims to be typical, really. Most people even vow to themselves sometime in high school or college not to be typical. But still, they just kind of loop back to it somehow. Like the circular rails of a train at an amusement park. The scripts we know offer a brand of security, offer predictability, of safety for us. But the problem is, they only take us where we've already been. They loop us back to places where everyone can easily go, not necessarily where we were made to go. Living a different kind of life takes some guts and grit and a new way of seeing things. Not only does God call us to love each other when He calls us to love people, but He calls us to speak for those who don't have a voice. He calls us to speak for those who are hurting. He calls us to love the abused. He calls us to love the broken and the people who don't have margin. He calls us to love the person you don't like. He gives us 50 ways to love one another, but it doesn't stop there. He calls us to love unborn children and kids neglected and abused. That's why our church partners with Families for Families, so that we can stand in the gap for the 11,000 kids in Georgia alone that don't have a system at home, a family. They're in the foster care system. They're living in hotels and other people's homes. You are called to support that as the church. We're called to love those who've been human trafficked. According to our government, approximately 27 million people are trafficked every year worldwide. In case you don't know what human trafficking is the trade in people, especially women and children. The Department of Homeland Security defines human trafficking as this: a modern-day form of slavery involving the illegal trade of people for exploitation or commercial gain. Since 2007, Georgia alone has had 13,000 victims identified. Last year, we had 500 victims identified. On October 19th, Macon's going to have a walk for freedom to help draw attention to this issue. Loving people could just start by going on a walk. So you go back to that Bob Goff quote, we can't keep doing the same things we've always done, expecting for a different result. If we expect to love people, we have to get messy. We have to get our hands in all of the places. And not all of you need to do everything. I love the quote from Families for Families. It talks about you can change, you can't change, one person can't change the world, but you can change the world for one person. Start with something small. How are you loving people? How are you loving the orphans and the widows? How are you loving the minority people groups, the lonely, the hurting? And the list goes on and on. And I wanted to mention, one of the ways that we love people here is through our table setters. As we walked in this morning, you saw all of these signs down front. These represent each individual ministry that we have in the church, at least on a Sunday morning. There are more ministries than this, because you have missional communities, you have missions teams, you have leaders, you have elders, you have other ministries that go on in our church. You might say, oh, this is just a plug to serve. No, it's not. Listen, the church exists to love God and love people and invest in His kingdom. And one of the mechanisms that He's given us as Piedmont to do that is through ministries like these. And you are called to serve. You are called to be a part of those ministries. Table setters are people who have decided that they will serve others by creating spaces on Sunday morning that will lead others to Jesus. Listen, if you've grown up in churches or been around a church at all in your life, you've probably heard this old mantra that 20% of the people do 80% of the work. And I think a lot of churches fit into that category. But praise God, we don't. 66% of people who have a seat at the table at Piedmont serve every single month here. Amen. There we go. Come on. I mean, I give y'all good stats at the beginning, the end. Y'all just don't like stats. I mean, come on. 66% of our people who say, this is my church, they serve every single month. But here's the reality. We're a growing church. We're a young church. We've got people coming in and going out. We need more people to serve. At the end of the service, I'm going to show you a slide. We have several people in our church that are serving 2 and 3 spaces every single week or month at our church, while some of us don't serve in any. And so if you call this place home, if you're saying, I got a seat at the table, I'm telling you that not only does God call you to love people outside of these walls, but He's telling you to serve here too. And if you don't believe me, you can go to 1 Corinthians. You can open the Bible, and you'll read this passage that talks about in chapter 12 how you are the body. And you were brought here for a purpose. And that purpose wasn't so that I couldn't see a green seat, but I could see a body in front of the green seat. You're called to serve. And we need you. I'd love for you to serve alongside of my team and me every Sunday morning. Maybe just once a month, right? We'll start off there. This is one of the things that we're going to be talking about over the next several weeks in our Gospel 101 thing, but I want you to hear this now. Loving people isn't additional. It's just intentional. Loving people isn't additional work. We could walk away from a sermon like this and we could think, man, he's just asking me to do all these other things. Well, first, I'm not asking you to do anything. I think the Lord is. I didn't say anything scripturally that wasn't already here. And I'm not asking you to add things to your life. I'm asking you to make your life intentional. And I'm asking you to look at your life and say, how am I loving people? Bride, husband, how are we loving people? Family, how are we loving people? If you have kids in the room, parents, let me tell you this. One of the greatest ways you can lead your kids to the gospel isn't by having a Bible study once a week. I think it's important to open the Word with your kids. But you know what I think is more important? It is serving with your kids and modeling service. If you tithe, talk to them about tithing. Because listen, some of our generations were raised in this thing where they saw us open books, but they never saw us serve. What do kids see and think about faith when they hear you talk about, well, we got to go to church, oh, we got to read our Bible, but they never see you love the broken. They never see you have grace in your life. They never hear about the ways that you sacrifice, the way that you invest in his kingdom. What kind of faith are you modeling? Take it to heart. Grandparents, friends, uncles, kids are watching us. The next gen is watching us. We got a whole row of them right here. They're looking at me. It's like eyes, right? Earlier, it's the third Sunday. We got Piedmont kids coming in here and watch us. And I don't know if you noticed, those little kids, they look around, they watch you worship. Is this how you worship this morning? Christ is my firm foundation, a rock on. Man, I believe that. That's strong words right there, right? I'm not telling you if you're not charismatic to Christ is our. I'm not telling you to do that, all right? That might be weird for you. But there's probably something in between this and this. You know what I mean? Probably a little something in between there. Band's going to come up. The question I want to end in today is, are you ready to make room for Jesus in your life? Picture this. What if we loved people like Jesus loved people? What if we really honored those one another's and we really looked to get messy in the areas of our life? Not adding additional things, but being intentional with the things he's already given us. Let's go to the Lord in prayer. Lord, will you help us to understand this calling, this commitment that you've given us? Would you lead us to a place where we can take steps of faith to fall deeper in love with you? We don't want to manufacture or go through the motions of this idea of loving people. We want to fall in love with people as you have called us to. We want to love our neighbor as ourselves, and we recognize that the only way to do that is to first and foremost fall in love with you. And so, God, if there's anyone in earshot right now that hasn't made that commitment, that hasn't made that decision to turn from themselves and believe in you, I'm calling them out this morning in the name and the power of Jesus to surrender. To say, Jesus, you are all that I want. God, for all of us in the room, would you show us the door to walk through to love people? Both here at Piedmont, maybe on a Sunday morning, or serving in the office, washing blankets, whatever it looks like. God, would you show us the door to walk through to love people here, the one another way, through MCs, whatever that is. But God, would you also show us avenues in which we can love the people around us? Maybe the seemingly unlovable people. the people who have been disregarded. God, break our heart for what breaks yours. And help us to form our lives around the gospel, the good news that you came for the whole world. And you're using us to point people back to you. It's in your Son's holy and precious name I pray these things, Jesus Christ. And God's people said,